Over, so we will now move to the first debate of the evening, which the whips have agreed will be on item 23. The motion from Councillors Osborne and Mrs Leonie Cooper on the Council's response to government cuts. I now call upon Councillor Osborne to move and Councillor Mrs L Cooper to second their motion.
Formally, if I may, Mr Mayor.
I'd like to second this motion formally, Mr Mayor.
Thank you. And I believe the first speaker is Councillor Carpenter.
It is indeed, Mr Mayor. Mr Mayor, this is an important debate because it delineates the difference in approach to the austerity programme imposed on local government by the incompetent Tory-led central government between the majority party and the opposition. This importance is recognised by the fact that there are 5 speakers on each side. My task is to introduce the debate and set it in its strategic context. Councillor Thomas will look at the Council's flawed approach to market testing. Councillor Daly will review the way in which the majority party has attacked frontline services. Councillor Cooper will draw attention to the inadequacies of the proposed departmental reorganisations, while Councillor Osborne will outline our alternative approach and deliver the coup de grace. Towards the end of 2010, the former leader of the Council issued the Wandsworth Challenge in response to the Tory-led government's austerity programme. I wrote a paper on it for the Labour group. It made 9 recommendations. 2.5 years later, the majority party are partway through implementing 4 of them. Why is this? It is because the majority party lacks strategic direction. If you don't know where you're going, you're unlikely to get there. Now, I know that there was a change in majority party leadership 2 years ago, and it takes time for a new leader to establish himself. But Councillor Govenment has had 2 years in which to get a grip, and in this he has manifestly failed. As a result, the Wandsworth Challenge, which could have been a strategic opportunity to reform Wandsworth Council, degenerated into an incoherent series of salami-slicing cuts. And now, it's happened again. 3 years down the road, we get another incoherent paper, proposing uncoordinated cuts with no sense of strategic direction. It's George Osborne's unravelling 2012 budget all over again. Rather than cobbling together departmental mergers which make no organisational sense, we should take a strategic step back and look at the overall picture. Mr Mayor, many Wandsworth Council functions are subscale in modern business terms. Rather than seeking economies of scope by merging departments within Wandsworth, we should be seeking the much greater economies of scale which are available from merging functions across local authorities. Indeed, there is a case for moving the strategic plane of some services, such as education and housing, up to the Mayor of London level. Equally, there is the opportunity, following the principles of the Localism Act, to devolve some administrative functions, such as housing service delivery, to a lower level of organisation. If the majority group were thinking radically, they would be considering the scope for splitting the administration into a commissioning or policy unit consisting of a few tens of people and a service delivery unit, which would reduce over time as proposals for relocating functions were implemented. If we can run London with 25 assembly members, why do we need 60 councillors to run Wandsworth? The simple answer is that we don't. Half the members of the majority party benches have very little to do for that 10,000 a year. Now, there's nothing new in any of this. All these ideas were in my 2010 paper on the Wandsworth Challenge. It's quite clear from the rag bag of proposals put forward by the majority party that they have lost their way. 2 years into his leadership, the leader is still struggling. Councillor Govenment, it's quite clear that you can't stand the heat. It's time to get out of the kitchen.
Councillor Govenment.
I think that was a very limited clap for the return of 10,000, for which Councillor Carpenter says that his colleagues don't work hard. Mr. Mayor, this motion has nothing to do with the restructuring proposals. I think this motion is simply an attempt to repair the failure of the opposition to do its job. It's very interesting Councillor Carpenter talks about his 9-point plan. Well, we don't know anything about it. It stayed in the Labour group, sat in the Labour group, never came out. Well, at what point are you making in saying we haven't embraced your plan if we don't know what it is? And this is clearly the way in which they have approached restructuring. Detailed scrutiny of any major proposal properly belongs in the committee and not in a grandstanding chamber to make speeches that carry weight but not substance. And let me explain what's happened here. When the first paper on the restructuring was considered in the February FCROSC, there was very limited discussion. It was so limited that I felt that I had turned up to present my paper without any kind of questioning of what I was doing, where was I coming from. And there was broad agreement that this was a good paper and this was a good direction. The only thing I recall was a bit of a Dutch auction. Why, if you are going to reduce 6 departments from 6 to 4, why not 3? So that was the only constructive contribution that I went home with. Well, then, of course, what happened was there was a Labour group meeting. And the Labour group meeting clearly felt differently from its members on FCROSS, and there was then an amendment at the last council meeting. So it is very plain to me that one part of the Labour Party wants something, the other part doesn't accept it. They have a big fight in the group, and they come and take up our time, allaying our fears that they are a united, they are a divided thing by pretending that they are united. Clearly they are not on this. I can't be surprised also that they feel that market testing is alien to this council, that we would not wish to market test. After all, we pioneered it. Why would we not want to market test other remaining services? But this time we are market testing with a difference. We are throwing into the pot the option of a staff mutual. We are throwing into the pot the option of sharing services with other authorities. Just the kind of scaling up of economies that Councillor Carpenter said, and he obviously has missed that bit of the paper. Without any coherent rationale, the first paper approved at FCROSS, came to this council, and they said, no, we don't do this. Second paper, I understand I wasn't at the FCROSS meeting, and I felt that it would have been a waste of my time to go there. But there wasn't much of a debate, as I understand it. There wasn't even a support for the staff side comment about lack of time for consultation. I thought brothers stuck with each other. There wasn't any attempt to support the staff side comment and criticism they made in their comments. So a few cheap shots about senior officers, and the paper was approved. Then once again the Labour group meeting happened, and brothers fell out, and the Bob Crow wing didn't like the kind of more constructive business-like wing, and they cobbled together a motion to say, oh well, we don't quite agree. So instead of having a rational, constructive, sensible debate in a scrutiny committee, they come to the no, let me just finish. Instead of doing that, they come here and say, well, let's have a debate because it'll make us feel better. Let me examine one bit of this idea that the current education department should remain unaltered and carry on. With widespread academization, clearly the role of the education department is going to reduce. The safeguarding and the children's services, the care bit of the department will remain active. Adult social services and children's social services at one time, until very recently, combined. The staff have the training in social work, which is uniform to both the halves of the social works in the two departments. Why not bring them together? Why not actually get at home some economies of scale, both in terms of training, nurturing the social workers in two different departments, getting them to work together, and the two halves working together to make a bigger one. The other major move is that for vulnerable children, particularly approaching 18, currently their care packages and their safeguarding package and the whole thing enters a chasm as they reach 18. Both these councils' thinking and the government's thinking in the care bill, it says so, that this chasm is not a good idea. Let us actually make that transition more meaningful, more sensible. And what we're doing with the merger of education and adult social services together is exactly to reduce that chasm, to make the transition of young vulnerable adults, from young vulnerable people, from childhood to adulthood without that kind of chasm and that kind of disruption. It can't be a bad thing to do that, I would have thought. But yet, of course, they don't quite see that. Because it's far too sensible, it's far too rational, it is not full of managerial mumbo-jumbo, because it is workmanlike, but it is deliverable, it is something that we can do and something that we will deliver. I fear that as the restructuring proposals go through, the Labour Party will continue to play this game. The game between the one lot who like it, the other lot who dislike it, don't understand why some of their colleagues like it, and they will waste our time in this kind of grandstanding kind of debates, and then we'll be back to normal again.
Councillor Thomas.
Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Mr. Mayor, as indicated by Councillor Carpenter, I want to focus specifically on one element of the Labour motion tonight, which concerns market testing. Let me start with what might just possibly be some common ground, although I don't know. I'd hazard a guess that the vast majority of members of the public out there actually aren't especially interested in how the council organises its different departments, even that many of them may not be that interested in the precise contractual mechanisms that we use to procure services. I think what matters to the public is the services that their council provides to them, the quality, the convenience, whether those services are sufficient to meet their needs, and how much they have to pay for them. So the kind of argument the majority party is running here might seem superficially quite seductive, basically making the case that we can have the same services for less through outsourcing and market testing. And indeed, just to be clear, because the majority party often seems confused and lost by our position. So to be absolutely clear, the Labour motion doesn't rule out market testing. We do believe that market testing may be appropriate in some cases. But what's absolutely critical here is the way in which market testing is approached. And in particular, we need to be asking ourselves the question, in what areas is market testing, in what areas might private sector outsourcing actually genuinely have the capacity to add value. If there are areas we can point to, and there's a good case to be made that the private sector has potentially better skills to bring to the job, then fine. If there are areas where the private sector can offer economies of scale, which the council couldn't, then fine. But I put it to you that actually what we have unfolding in front of us tonight is a very different picture. What we see is a race to the bottom, with savings targets being set. I think the figures are between 10 and 20%. And obviously there's a grave risk here that what providers are going to do is that they are going to compromise on the quality of the services that they provide. For instance, by reducing the number of skilled staff that they use to actually provide them. Now, I've got absolutely no doubt that the party opposite will protest that they've got an impressive track record of outsourcing, combining reduced costs with high standards. In response, I'd make just 2 points. Firstly, I think there's a difference between outsourcing a service such as road sweeping and some of the very complex and personal services that we're talking about here, such as youth services, which are far harder to specify, measure and define. Secondly, I'd really like to know on what basis the Council is proposing to potentially put these services out to tender. I would be willing to bet that in the vast majority of cases, once again, we're going to see services put out to tender on the basis of the lowest price that they can possibly get, with the quality playing second fiddle at best. 30 years ago, Nicholas Ridley set out his vision of a minimalist council that met once a year to hand out contracts to the private sector. Councillor Govenment was talking about how Wandsworth pioneered market testing and outsourcing, and then in fact he asked why would we not want to put to market the rest of the services that we still have in-house. And I think that actually indicates that in reality the vision isn't very much different now. Of course, we've got some lip service about shared services, about mutuals, but one can't help feeling that there's a very strong element of lip service to this, and that the Council's underlying policy continues to be a very strong sense of private sector good, public sector bad. And perhaps the real narrative is revealed by the fact that the two departments that under the proposals will remain unscathed are finance and administration. The history of public services is littered with examples of cases of the public sector, the private sector, over-promising and under-delivering. For instance, think of the privatisation of the railways, the appalling failures of care at Winterbourne View, the G4S Olympic security fiasco. I want any reforms to succeed. I want to see quality services deliver. And in fact, the public won't forgive us if we allow ourselves to be driven by dogma or anti-public sector feeling, the kind of mistakes that we've seen in the examples I've just cited. Let's ensure that both public and private are a means to an end, and that our first consideration remains providing high-quality services to residents.
Councillor Maxwell Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. What I thought I'd do for the benefit of councillors is just have a little bit of a trot through the motion, because I'm concerned, obviously, that if it were a beautifully written and coherent motion, the members on this side might be tempted to vote for it. But on closer inspection, I'm a little bit more confident that won't be the case. I was also concerned, seeing the order of speakers, that you might be wowed by the soaring rhetoric of Councillor 9-point plan and Councillor hands in pockets, but I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially when they choose to make reference to things like Winterbourne, but not in the same breath mention mid-staffs. We are fans of market testing, and I think the statistics countrywide for why we are show that. Subjecting in-house provision to competitive pressure creates average cost savings of between 10 and 20%, with quality of service maintained or improved. I think those are pretty straightforward figures. It's also a big question, point A of this motion. How do you know you're getting value for money, and that means cost and quality, unless you market test? It's up to the Council to ensure that there is no unnecessary deterioration in service. And our track record is, as you graciously say, very good when it comes to contract management. I think we'd argue, thanks to the excellence of our officers, second to none. As for staff employment rights, these are, as you will know, protected by TUPE and by the Fair Deal. But I should add, on top of this, that our purpose is not, of course, to provide jobs, it's to provide services, and that should be borne in mind. On point B, we've heard already from the leader about his disappointment that the opposition group has chosen this juncture to concern itself with our necessary and commendable restructuring. But what I think is more disappointing to me, and especially because I seem to recall that this point was raised by me at the last full council meeting, was that part B of this motion contains within it a split infinitive. Now, some people think that might not matter, but my suggestion is that muddled English suggests muddled thinking, and the rest of the motion suggests that to be an entirely fair assessment. On to point C, conducting a more extensive search for savings by entering into joint ventures. I think if we put a full stop there, that would have been absolutely fine. I think to limit it to just other London boroughs seems a little bit geographically curious, but maybe one of the other contributors later will explain why we can't look for savings outside of the M25. There's also no account taken in the motion of the behaviour of these other councils? Would they, for example, want to go into a venture with the other London borough that believed in market testing as well, including for the services they have listed in this motion? It seems to me to be a little bit woolly there. On point D, staff mutuals, again, I think there's a lot to be commended there, but I think the contempt which has been already voiced tonight from their side for the private sector may come home to haunt them, because whilst mutuals are a good idea in theory, I think we may find that staff, no matter how skilled and talented and ambitious, may struggle to achieve the service we want from them without recourse to help and advice from external parties, including the private and voluntary sectors on such things as payroll, HR, IT and others. So I think it needs a little bit more meat to it than that. And finally, on point E, this really seems to be in dramatic contrast to point A, because what they're saying here is that we shouldn't market test for most stuff, but we should market test for directors. Well, which is it? Do you believe in market testing or do you not? And I'll also make the point that by not using the very talented people we do have in the suggested ways we have made, we would in fact be causing considerably higher redundancy payments, which I think should be avoided. So overall, I'm really not very impressed by this at all, and I'd urge members to vote it down.
Councillor Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In local government, we certainly live in interesting times, which in China, I believe, is regarded as a curse. Whether this turns out to be a curse or an opportunity really depends on how the council grasps this particular nettle going forward. Whatever immediate sort of budgetary measures or restraints which are out there, which is discussed in the motion, the fact that we face some sort of major corporate restructuring is probably pretty much on the cards anyway, bearing in mind all the other pressures we face in Wandsworth across the board and indeed in the international picture. To protect frontline services, we will need a leaner and more streamlined council. And I, for one, believe that what has been proposed achieves those goals in a balanced way and protects frontline services, which is really, of course, what concerns the public at the end of the day. A major change in the restructuring papers is, of course, the creation of a new four-departmental model with a new resident services department and a new Department of Education and Social Services. As has been said on this side of the chamber, there's more synergy and compatibility with this model than what is proposed in the motion. Essentially what we're doing is putting back departments which previously existed and actually work better than perhaps they have done at the moment with changes forced on us at national level. We also need to press ahead and fill the director posts in the new departments as soon as feasible, as the council is doing, given the need for leadership at a senior level. Now, market testing is something which has, of course, come up in the debate already, and it has proved to be a reliable route in the past for achieving savings, and there's every expectation that this will be the case going forward, and this must remain the main plank for achieving savings. However, with new markets emerging in the with the service sector, the restructuring proposals have also highlighted other alternatives. And one of these is the concept of staff spin-outs or staff mutuals, which is referred to in the motion. A spin-out or mutual is there's a kind of staff buyout in management speak, where services or departments splits off and becomes a standalone entity, with the council effectively becoming a customer. Staff mutual enterprise is a favoured model of the government. It's something actually which is being pushed by the government, which isn't something mentioned in the actual motion. At the moment it's had a pretty low sort of traction. It's not gaining much speed, but it's something which is at least starting to pick up speed. And the four priority areas which have been identified in the proposals for market testing, we generally look to be suitable as a concept in order to roll out the kind of mutual model. I mean, as a concept, mutuals I don't think are suitable for all departments. Where it is being tried in other councils, it involves departments where the main asset is the staff themselves, as opposed to where there are substantial assets, which can give rise to all sorts of complications. But the areas we have identified, I think it would be suitable for this model to be used. And the idea of a spin-out, in my view, offers huge potentials, not just for savings, but to encourage a more entrepreneurial culture, with staff actively being involved in exploring different and better ways of delivering services. Indeed, this is a strand that runs through the whole sort of council's papers, with staff being encouraged to come up with ideas for staff-led alternatives and initiatives and savings. But at the same time, we do have to be realistic, particularly given the pressures we're under and the time frames involved. Clearly, we have to be confident that staff mutuals, or whatever concepts come up with, can compete and can be cost-effective, which is why market testing remains fundamental. Not every department will be suitable for staff spin-outs. It's still very early days. As I understand, only one council has actually put a major sort of spin-out in motion, Hammersmith and Fulham, and there are proposals to do it with youth services in K&C. So whilst there's still storm clouds out there, there are opportunities, and it is important that the council is at the vanguard of a new frontier in delivering council services. So in a nutshell, I think the council has grasped the proverbial nettle and is on the right track, and I would urge you to reject the motion. Thank you.
Councillor Daly.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're now in the fourth year of a programme of cuts foisted on this council by the coalition government. And now that the failures of the Chancellor's economic strategy are beginning to unfold, the Council is being forced to make yet more cuts to our budgets over the next few years. On this side of the chamber, we do recognise that if we were running the Council, we would still need to find the same level of savings, contrary to what you keep saying, and would face the same difficult decisions. We'd just make them differently. Cutting almost £100 million from the budget of a council that has rarely indulged in extravagance is no easy feat, except in its senior pay, of course. But 3 years into this programme, a clear picture of the majority group's priorities and values is now starting to come into focus. Mr. Mayor, I want to take this opportunity to look back over where the council has chosen to make some of these cuts since 2010 and contrast these with the latest proposals to restructure the council. Back in 2010, just a few weeks after I was elected to the council, several £100,000 of cuts were made to the budget for helping those who are homeless. Free swimming for children and pensioners was withdrawn. Plans to develop new play facilities around the borough were scrapped. A few months later, daycare facilities for the elderly in Graveney were closed. Children's mental health team was cut. Cuts again which hit two of the most vulnerable groups in the borough. 2011 started off with more major cuts to the adult care budget as the Supporting People programme was scaled back, at the same time as residents across the borough saw the opening hours of libraries reduced significantly. Next, it was community safety on the block as the Parks Police were cut, and I know Councillor Johnson's very disappointed about that. We were delighted that he highlighted that this evening, followed by cuts to the budget for supporting carers. Youth clubs were closed, playgrounds were scaled back, and of course let's not forget the idea of charging children to play, which was aborted and is now being brought back to life as stay and play services are going to be charged for across much of the borough. More recently, school crossing patrols were axed, community safety services were rationalised, support for those with learning difficulties was cut, along with a number of other frontline services from the Children's Services Department. And finally, of course, we now face our 1 o'clock club services being axed or charged for. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list by any means, but a pick of some of the most key frontline services which the majority party had chosen to cut, claiming it had no other option. And yet here we are now, Mr. Mayor, 3 years on, considering proposals to make savings by cutting down 6 council departments to 4, a move which will reduce the number of overpaid hay-band staff and make significant savings without having a major impact on the front line. Residents who relied on the Church Lane Daycare Centre or the children who saw their youth club shut might well be left wondering why the council could not have made savings by merging departments 3 years ago and beyond the leisure and amenities one. Instead, frontline services were cut first and senior management were only put in the firing line when the leaders started to run out of ideas. It's often said in this chamber that the Labour group opposes all cuts. In fact, it's been repeated many times this evening. But this is just simply not the case. We accept the reality of the situation. Savings have to be made, but our priorities would be entirely different to those of the party opposite. We would have started with seeking savings through departmental mergers and done everything in our power to protect the frontline services that have been lost, making more effort to foster community cooperatives and exploring more cross-border border joint ventures. It's not simply good enough to say it's government policy to have staff mutuals. You've got to create a culture for that, and you've got to foster an environment where those come to life. As we embark on yet another phase of cuts, we are simply imploring the majority parties tonight to protect what is left of the valuable frontline services which our residents rely on. And I urge members to support our motion and our vision of a fairer future for the residents of Wandsworth.
Councillor Locker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to begin by apologising, as the debate is proving a lot more hard-nosed tonight than my original reading of the motion, and consequently when I wrote my speech. I was planning to say that there were elements of this motion that I agree with, once the political rhetoric is stripped out. For example, I'm delighted to see tonight the cross-party support for staff mutuals, and I know that the Council is, in fact, keen to encourage employees who wish to explore such an approach. Clearly there is scope with staff cooperatives to empower employees to identify savings themselves and give them a real stake in the provision of services. However, I don't see why staff mutualisation and market testing need be, well, mutually exclusive, as implied in the text of the motion before us. If an internal staff mutual is to be a success, surely testing itself against the wider market will demonstrate all that it has to offer. Market testing does not necessarily result in switching to an external provider. In the last year, the Council's in-house operational services team successfully bid to retain the tender for the borough's highway maintenance contract, beating competitors from the market on both cost and quality, a testament to the professionalism and efficiency of the in-house team, as well as providing the best possible deal for local council taxpayers. We've also seen in the last year how market testing can make a significant contribution towards us meeting our objectives. The case of tendering the library services, for instance, has helped us keep all of our libraries open, whilst at the same time allowing for £6 million of savings to council taxpayers over the lifetime of the contract, a model that contrasts with the cut-and-run approach adopted by many local authorities elsewhere. Consequently, I think the motion is wrong to seek to limit the scope of market testing. I do welcome the sentiments of the motion in calling for more joint working with other local authorities. In fact, we are already proactively looking to do so where there is a beneficial match, such as with our joint management of the Council's pension scheme with the Borough of Camden, which just goes to show that we need not be constrained by party political differences. But as Councillor Maxwell Scott said, why should we limit ourselves to the M25? If it's sensible to do so, and they can provide the best prospect for Wandsworth, surely it's right to go elsewhere as well. On the question of the Council's departmental structure, as I described at our last meeting, streamlining our organisation will provide new opportunities for making it easier for local people to deal with us. There are still too many handovers between departments and too much scope for confusion for our residents. So the majority party proposals to build our structure around the type of service delivery and whether or not it is universal or personalised will make it simpler for our residents to understand and use. Unlike the motion, I don't believe there is anything incompatible in the proposed departmental mergers. In fact, they should provide the potential for synergies, such as between cleaning our streets and housing estates, or by greater collaboration between children's and adult social services, as the leader mentioned earlier, enabling us to focus on troubled families. So, Mr. Mayor, whilst I recognise that some of my Labour colleagues have very pragmatically taken a step towards backing the proposals for reorganising Wandsworth services, I hope that this evening we can persuade them to forego the caveats and posturing of their current motion and instead give their full support, just as they did when the original Finance and Corporate Resources paper was debated in committee. It would send an important message to our staff and residents, showing that we are working together to restructure the Council
Councillor Locker, taking intervention?
No, to meet the demands of the current financial climate, whilst at the same time keeping service at the forefront of all we do. Thank you.
Councillor Daly, if I may be permitted one little minor observation. If you want to keep interrupting, you're going to have to let people interrupt you from time to time. But we move on now to Councillor Leonie Cooper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor and fellow members. Well, we've already heard from quite a number of colleagues on both sides, and in particular Councillor Carpenter, who started the debate, Councillor Thomas, who's already mentioned the need to bring together finance and administration into one department, and Councillor Daly, who's talked about our previous support, and I've written several speeches on this, for the reduction of numbers of Hay-Band staff and the bringing together into 4 large executive directorates. So I'm not particularly keen to listen to any lectures from amnesiac members opposite who've obviously forgotten a number of the speeches that we've previously made on reducing the number of departments to 4. I specifically want to spend some time, but not too long, because we have got a large number of speakers in this debate, talking about the issues of which departments should be brought together. And I'm going to do that with particular reference to some of the experience that I've had working both within the M25 for local authorities, outside of the M25, and well beyond that, in London and across the country. And just as an aside to Councillor Davis, who seems to think that these are interesting times, but if they are interesting, the curse, of course, is mentioned in our motion, and that is otherwise known as Eric Pickles, who was first in the queue to ensure that the curse is ginormous for local authorities and making sure that financial support from central government was massively reduced. So if you'd like to solve the curse that we're all suffering from, you know what to do. Now, in the leader's answer to question 8, he acknowledged that Wandsworth is, as he said, rather unusual in having retained such a large housing stock. In our case, over 34,000 units still in our management. There are at absolute most 50 or 60 members of ARCH, the Association of Retained Council Housing, in which we play a leading role, courtesy of Councillor Ellis, who's unfortunately reading the paper, so he won't have noticed what I'm talking about. But if, of course, as I listen to all of yours too, but even amongst ARCH members, Wandsworth is unusual, and our stock is large in comparison. Barking and Dagenham, for example, also in London, their stock is approximately 20,000, so much, much smaller. So bearing in mind that we do retain full responsibility for 34,000 units, approximately 17,500 tenants, 17,500 leaseholders, quite a complex operation, it would seem sensible for us to think very carefully about how we manage our housing stock, bearing in mind a number of features and factors: its capital value, the investment needs of the stock, the number of local residents whose lives are impacted in a very serious way by the condition of the stock and the surrounding areas, and of course the large number of our staff who are employed in the housing department. Now, bearing all of the above in mind, I find the structure as currently proposed extremely concerning. Environment and Community Service, which came together since I became a member of what was originally the Environment and Leisure Committee, is already an enormous department, and should, in our view, stand alone. And just to give you a quick comparison, in London, probably the authority that has the nearest level of stock, which it still retains, is Southwark, actually larger than us, with about 40,000 properties, and their housing department is not brought together with both environment and community services, but just with community services. So instead of putting housing together with, and I must say I am really enjoying whoever's mobile phone keeps ringing.
Could I just ask, that is the second time it's gone off. Could you please switch the thing off, please?
It sounds like the theme tune to American
I don't care what it is, I don't like it.
Instead of putting housing together with environment and community services, making an absolutely enormous department, we think that putting housing together with health and adult social services is a much better approach. This will keep the focus on the people who live in the properties, rather than putting housing together with environment and community services and risking focusing in on equipment and buildings instead. So that we are providing a top-notch service to the people who live in the properties, and we will then continue to have that proper focus and manage those properties extremely well. And of course, nobody visiting our estates currently would believe this to be the case. Unfortunately, there are many common parts which are not in very good condition. This is a great opportunity to really improve and transform some of our long-neglected estates and transform the lives of residents. But in addition, it also has the benefit of leaving 2 of the departments unchanged. Now, we had a little discourse from Councillor Belton earlier about too little change, but I think it is fair to say that too much change is as bad as too little change. And for these reasons, and the ones advanced by my colleagues, I would really urge you to support our motion. Thank you.
Councillor Senior.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I hope you'll be pleased to hear that I do intend to keep my remarks on this issue, as you said, succinct, because we do seem to somewhat be going round and round in the same circles on this matter tonight. But there are a couple of things that I have perhaps noticed. The first, I remind you of that old and possibly apocryphal prayer of, "O Lord, make me virtuous, but not yet." Because it seems when you read the Labour Party's motion, there are things in it which sound good, like referencing to market testing, but not quite. There are issues, there are problems, so we don't really want to go down that route at all, or we want to do it in a way that's so covered in restrictions that it doesn't actually lead to producing any meaningful savings. And a good example of that, perhaps as Councillor Locker has already mentioned, is the library service, a very unusual thing to do, to put out our libraries to tender. In fact, we've achieved an enormous saving on that without any major cuts to our service provision. The second thing that I've noticed tonight is the astonishing vagueness of the Labour Party's proposals. Other than talking about reducing the number of top officers, which has gone down by 25% already over the last 3 years, and arguing whether or not we should put together departments in a different way from what is being proposed, I don't think I have heard any particular proposals tonight to make actual savings. And I would have thought that the Labour Party, having gone to the trouble of having this lengthy debate, putting a lengthy motion, we would have actually heard some specifics. We haven't. Nor did we hear those specifics at the last 2 meetings of the Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I think the leader was probably quite right not to waste his time, as he put it, coming along to the last meeting, so little debate there actually was at the OSC concerns. Now, I've been a member of this council for quite a few years, as you'll be aware of. I'm not quite the father of the council, like Councillor MacDonald, the father of the army. But what I do know is that for virtually all the time I've been a councillor, we have actually been cutting our budgets. And that's because governments of all political colours have been constantly reducing the amount of funding going to government, local government in London. And frankly, sometimes it's tough going. But we have, generally speaking, done that pretty effectively and pretty well. And we've continued to be able to reduce both services that are independently rated as being good value and at a low council tax. I see no reason why the skills that we've learnt over the years cannot continue, and why we should not continue in the way that we have been doing so far, rather than going off down the blind alley the Labour Party are sort of suggesting.
Councillor Osborne.
Well, it falls to me, as you heard earlier on, to deliver the coup de grace. Exactly. For those members of the Conservative benches whose French is poor, coup de grace is not the French term for a lawnmower. It's something quite different, as you will see as I go on. And while we're on the subject of language, I'm interested by Councillor Maxwell Scott's references to split infinitives. English is a democratic language. It evolves, it changes, and I would say for some decades, split infinitives have been quite acceptable in the English language. And it's illustrative. It is illustrative. It is illustrative of just how old-fashioned and blinkered this administration is. And what we need is an administration which is prepared to carry this council forward with a degree of courage which this council has not yet been able to show. It talks about taking harsh decisions, but actually, when it comes to it, all it can do is tinker.
and it ducks the harsh decisions sometimes. Let's take some examples. In the face of government cuts, it has crumpled and its coherence has gone away. We used to have something called the Wandsworth Way. Well, that's wobbled away into the wilderness, I think, now. For a while, we had something called the Wandsworth Challenge. That fell apart at the seams. I think it's now reduced to a single page on the council's website. And all we can see is a set of tinkering with the council's budgets. And I want to pick out a couple of things from the council's plan at the moment, things which we tried to address in our resolution. Let's take, for example, the references to staff mutuals. There's been several of them, and there's been a lot of talk about how both Labour and Conservative councils are willing to experiment with them. But what's in the council's plans is very slight. It's just a brief mention all the time. Other councils have done something quite different when they've talked about staff mutuals. If you look at what other councils do, they say, OK, we're faced with this problem. Let's turn the disadvantage of government cuts into an advantage if we can. Let's look at staff mutualisation and co-ops and other systems. What we will do is we will bring together the professional staff and the residents and the councillors to see if we can solve some problems which were otherwise not faced up to and otherwise not resolvable. Something which there's no attention to yet in this administration's paperwork. What we've got instead is a council that goes for a very simple reference to it, a passing reference, and the detail isn't considered. It's like it's too dangerous to look at somehow. What we've got is a council that would rather be blinkered, rather be old-fashioned, stay at home in its dark room, not get out much, and not look at all these radical ideas that are floating around elsewhere, in both Conservative and Labour councils. Let's look at the option on sharing services. Yes, of course, we have the pension arrangement with Camden. We had the brief joint procuring with Croydon, short-lived, but very good in its day. There will be others. There have been others. But again, it's a slight reference all the time. We never really seem to grasp the nettle on this subject. What we've got is a council, like some poor character at the disco that stands at the side, too nervous to ask somebody for a dance and unable to move forward. There is, of course, one big dance, that's the Nine Elms dance, which we're involved with another council on, but we have to be involved in that because it's taking place in our own front room. We can't possibly avoid it. So time and again, we are not moving forward, we are not facing the future, we are not grasping the nettle on what it is we set out to do. Time and again, there is a chance to move forward and we have passed it up. That's not the kind of borough we want. That's not the kind of borough we're trying to describe in our resolution. It's not the kind of borough our residents want either. What I am saying to this council is this. The residents of this borough want something quite different. I urge you all to support this motion. Thank you.
Councillor Madden. Could you turn your microphone on, please? Thank you.
My interpretation of a coup de grace is a mercy killing, and it would do everybody good for the party opposite to adopt that stance. And
the motion before the council concerning the council's response to government cuts as proposed by Councillor Osborne and seconded by Councillor Leonie Cooper. Would you please indicate by a show of hands those in favour of the motion? And all those against the motion? And all those abstaining. The result of the voting is 12 for the motion, 41 against the motion. The motion is lost.